I want to bring in my first guest now. It's Michael Sukkar, who's the Minister for Housing and the Assistant Treasurer. The perfect guest for this afternoon. Michael Sukkar, welcome.
Hi Patricia, great to be with you.
The government had forecast a deficit of $4.2 billion for the financial year. Instead, you've delivered a deficit of just $690 million. Do you accept, though, that the $4.6 billion underspend in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, whatever the reason for it, has been critical to achieving this?
Well, Patricia, no. I mean, this is pretty desperate diversionary tactics from the Labor Party. And in fact, if you go back to when the budget was handed down, this is some $13.8 billion better than we had forecast then. So this is a significant improvement because, unlike the Labor Party, and we all remember the days of Wayne Swan when the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was his senior advisor, they would promise surpluses and deliver deficits. We take a conservative approach to budget management, and we've seen today with a $690 million deficit, essentially a balanced budget, that we have overshot and overmet all of those expectations which we created when this budget was handed down. And of course, since April, it's improved even further from the bit over $4 billion deficit that we projected. So this is good news. It shows that, it just shows, Patricia, that budget management that is disciplined can deliver dividends, and after 11 years of deficits, we think it's extraordinarily important to do this and to deliver a surplus this year. As for the pretty desperate...
Well, I don't know if it is desperate. I mean, it's in the budget papers, so...
No, Patricia, you are...
$4.6 billion underspent in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and clearly
Patricia,
the bottom line is affected by this. How can you argue it's not? It's in black and white.
Well, Patricia, the reason why I took you through the budget forecast so slavishly is because, as you are aware, and many of your viewers will be aware, when you set a budget, you can do one of two things. You can take a conservative approach, which is our approach, which means we tend to ensure that we fully factor in any potential spending, and we underestimate to a certain degree revenue, or we certainly don't do what the Labor Party did, which was bake in and factor in expenditure which was never going to realise itself. The NDIS, we have spent twice as much in this year's budget as we did last. What you do in budgets, as you know, is you take a best and a conservative approach to what the expected expenditure is going to be. As was outlined in question time today, we have been relying on data from the states, certainly on the number of people that would transition from the state-based disability schemes into the NDIS. In factoring in what we expected the NDIS to cost, we took that state-based data at face value. As it's turned out, the full numbers of people that have been calling on the NDIS in that time has been quite a bit lower than what the states had outlined, and so the final budget outcome reflects that. But this is an uncapped scheme, Patricia. This is, if you meet the criteria, if you apply, you get an NDIS package.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
This is a completely uncapped scheme. So it is quite a desperate and grubby tactic from the Labor Party to really try to politicise this.
If there were no criticisms of the NDIS, or if people trying to interface with this system hadn't told us time after time that they were finding it incredibly difficult. So why wouldn't the government acknowledge that the underspend may actually reveal that there's a bit of a problem with the way it's happening, the way it's being rolled out, and people's access to this funding package?
I think the more significant message here is, Patricia, is that over time the NDIS is going to cost some $25 billion, and in order for a government to be able to solemnly promise the Australian people that it will deliver such an uncapped program, that we have to get our fiscal house in order, and that's what today is about. Today is about the government, after 6 years of hard work, 6 years of turning around the debt and deficit disaster of the Labor Party, seeing some fruits for the labour of Australians in a balanced budget. I think it gives Australians confidence that we will deliver on the surplus this year that we have promised. Let's not forget, Patricia, the budget we inherited from the Labor Party was a $48 billion deficit. So in a pretty short period of time, we've turned a $48 billion deficit into a balanced budget, and next year, or this year, a surplus budget. The only way you can guarantee the NDIS, the only way you can look at those families in the eye and say with certainty that we can provide for your loved one in an uncapped NDIS is if we get our house in order. So this is why it's quite desperate and grubby from the Labor Party, because I don't think if the Labor Party carried on with their debt and deficit disaster that they would be able to do that, because quite frankly the fiscal position of the Australian government would be in tatters.
Okay, let's leave Labor. They lost the election. You're in charge.
Well, Patricia,
so what they can deliver is kind of irrelevant to this conversation. I need to get you on your portfolio, so let me move on. Lord Mayors from across the country want to strike a deal to have social housing debts to the Commonwealth waived so the money can be funneled into new social housing, similar to the deal that you struck with Tasmania. Will you consider it?
Well, no, actually, I mean, that was a request from one jurisdiction, but the capital city mayors were really speaking to me about the homelessness issues that tend to be coalescing around the major cities, and they're seeing that a lot of the homelessness issues that have been over previous decades dispersed more broadly in their state are now starting to really impact the major cities more than ever before. And they have asked for a couple of things. They want to renegotiate the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which is a funding agreement between the Commonwealth and the states, where the Commonwealth provides each year $1.3 billion of funding, which is then allocated by the states into housing and homelessness programs. Well, as I said to them, we renegotiated the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement just about 12 months ago or 18 months ago was when it commenced, and it would require the agreement of all of the states and territories. So really what I've said to them is if they are able to convince their particular state and territories of which they are their capital cities reside, we would be happy to look at it. But
yeah, but you're also in charge here federally, so instead of just making them do the work, if you think it's a good idea, why don't you do the same thing and go to the states and territories and say we need to change this?
Because we've just renegotiated the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, Patricia, and I'd be very happy to come back and take you through in detail the series of requests and additional work that we hoped to bake into that agreement, but the states and territories couldn't agree to. So in the end, it's got to be an agreement.
Tasmania's got a better deal than any other state. Surely you can understand the frustration of people who want to waive those debts so that they can put it into social housing and help all those people that you talk about.
Well, Patricia, again, that wasn't discussed yesterday other than with the ACT Chief Minister. So
let me just put it to you, though.
Of the discussion.
It doesn't seem fair that Tasmania got a special deal that other states haven't. Would you consider extending that to other states and territories?
Well, what I've said very clearly is Tasmania met a very high bar for this particular debt forgiveness. Firstly, they were able to demonstrate a really significant and urgent need. Secondly, they were able to demonstrate that they would use all of the money that was saved, $230 million for Tasmania, that they would ensure was put back into housing and homelessness services. And crucially, they committed to undertaking serious planning reform, statewide planning reform, which would ensure that the supply of housing kept up with population growth. Because in the end, Patricia, in the housing space, if you're not getting enough houses or dwellings out of the ground to meet the demand of the market, that you will always have affordability issues, and we know that that cascades all the way along the housing spectrum, from the private rental market to the social housing market, the community housing market, and of course into homelessness. So Tasmania met a very high bar, and I know that other states and territories have seen what that looks like, and they are of course free, as the ACT Chief Minister did yesterday, to make the request, and of course we would consider it on a case-by-case basis. But to think that Tasmania didn't give a lot in exchange for that forgiveness is wrong. Okay. And you know, I would expect that it would be quite difficult for some jurisdictions to meet that bar, but of course that's up to them if they're willing to do that.
It's estimated, though, that Australia needs to build 1 million social and affordable housing homes by 2036. That's the modelling. So do you accept that you need to start providing that now to deal with this unfolding crisis on our streets? We see it every day. You live in Melbourne, I live in Melbourne. We see it every day.
Well, Patricia, you should familiarise yourself with the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which the
I'm
now
familiar.
Prime Minister, when he was Treasurer, and I delivered in a really significant budget with a huge housing component. It's in its first year funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into community housing through government-backed and government-guaranteed debt. It will also shortly be deploying funds out of a $1 billion infrastructure facility, which is essentially a facility to get these sorts of projects out of the ground. I think in its first year we've seen significant projects, building finance, new projects, partnerships with state governments where the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation has been involved. We think this model works. The community housing sector, I think, has absolutely applauded the government's decision to set up NIFIC.
OK, but do you think more needs to be done? I mean, that's at the core of my question. You're talking about what you're already doing. The sector saying more needs to be done to meet this unfolding crisis. Do you accept that you need to do more?
Well, Patricia, the point I keep making, because it's extraordinarily important here, is that local governments and state governments, which control our planning schemes and zoning, really hold the keys to the biggest areas of reform that is necessary, because there's a lot of capital. There's a lot of community housing providers that now have increased access to capital due to the work of this government. But deploying that capital and getting houses out of the ground is a lot more difficult because of very slow, truncated, unpredictable planning schemes. And in our meeting, or in my meeting with capital city Lord Mayors, I mean, that was quite frankly acknowledged by them. In the end, there's not a shortage of capital ready to be deployed in this space, but there's a shortage of opportunities due to those issues. So I don't want to point the blame at any individual or level of government. We're willing to work as we have and put our money where our mouth is to get these sorts of reforms happening. But in the end, I would be lying to you, Patricia, if I said that I have a silver bullet solution that I can deploy in every housing market around the country, remembering that the housing market in Melbourne is very different to South East Queensland, very different to metropolitan or regional Western Australia.
Just briefly, the government is also guaranteeing home loan deposits through the National Housing Finance Corporation for 10,000 eligible Australians. It's not a lot of spots, is it? I mean, it's a very small program, 10,000 people. It's a pretty big country. Is this a wait-and-see program? Are you willing to expand it if you think it ends up being successful?
Well, Patricia, it's a phenomenal program, and it's 10,000 first-home buyers a year is significant. I mean, that's 10,000 a year, and it will ensure that first-home buyers can get their foot onto the property ladder with as little as a 5% deposit. And as I said in Parliament yesterday, one of the hardest things for first-time buyers, as it's expressed to me and other members of the government, is getting that deposit together. The average time it's taking people to get a deposit together in Sydney and Melbourne is 10 years and 8 years respectively. There are income caps that will be applied to this scheme, which starts on the 1st of January next year. So it's $125,000 for an individual or $200,000 for a couple. There'll be house caps as well, so to ensure that it's going to those who most need it. And that means that, in our view, there's a pretty good opportunity that if you qualify and you want one of these guarantees, you will get a really good opportunity of getting one. Like all these things, we'll have it ready for the 1st of January. We'll assess how it goes. I think it's going to be very popular. I think
and if
people
it is,
are going
would you
to
look
be
at making it a bigger program?
Well, let's just see how it goes, Patricia.
But are you open to that? Because, I mean, it has been criticised for being small. This is the critique.
Well, I don't think that is a fair criticism at all. I don't think 10,000 loans a year. This is not 10,000 over the life of the program. 10,000 loans a year.
But are you open
to
expanding it and making it available to more first homeowners?
Well, Patricia, I think that's prejudging what I've just said to you. I think we want to see how it goes. I think it's going to be very popular. And of course, we always assess the programs such as this that get started and how they're going, and we would do the same in this instance, no doubt.
Just finally, on a story that's broken this afternoon, the federal court has ruled that the Tamil family from Biloela can remain in Australia until their case against deportation is decided. What do you make of this decision? Because clearly the courts have decided that they can fight their way through the system.
Well, I don't think that's particularly news to anyone, Patricia. I think we've all seen instances where people who are seeking protection or in one form or another trying to either get permanent residency in Australia are able to exhaust a whole lot of legal entitlements, and those can often stretch into years and years and years. So I don't think it's a particular surprise to see in this instance that they're exhausting all of their legal avenues. And in the end, we operate by the rule of law, but we know as a coalition that it is extraordinarily important to have an immigration system that has integrity, that treats everybody with fairness, that doesn't treat some cases differently because they're high profile, that treats every case on its merits. And I think in this particular case we've had a number of courts, not just one, a number of courts who have determined that the applicants in this particular circumstance are not genuine refugees. That is a decision of a court, and here we've got a decision that's provided some additional time for them to exhaust further legal avenues, and that's to be expected and not unsurprising, I suppose, Patricia.
Michael Sukkar, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.